Chapter 27. The Speech That Cost a Million Dead. Consider this unquestionable fact. The final act which transformed the Continental War into a world war was ordained by the secret elite. The person who fronted that decision, who did indeed snuff out the lamps all over Europe, was the man who allegedly made that observation, the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Sir Edward Grey. The tipping point was his statement to the House of Commons on Monday, August 3, 1914, and its subsequent impact on Parliament, the nation, and the Empire. To most members of Parliament, the events of the bank holiday Monday came in a blur of excitement and disbelief. One Irish member recalled how it was only at the point where parliamentary attendants began to set out additional seats in the chambers of the Commons that he realized something wholly unusual was expected. So many members of Parliament crammed into the claustrophobic chamber that even the additional seatings could not cope. There was an electricity of expectation and uncertainty and apprehension that few had ever experienced. Yet even before they had time to gather, the Relugus Three took preparation for war to the brink. On Asquith's instructions, Haldane returned to his old stamping ground at the War Office and summoned the Army Council. By his own account, the generals had their breath somewhat taken away when he announced that he carried the Prime Minister's authority to immediately mobilize the expeditionary and territorial forces, the Special Reserve, and the Officers' Training Corps. To the astonishment of the public, trains to New Haven and Southampton were requisitioned for the exclusive use of the military. He wrote that it was a matter of life and death. All of this took place before Grey rose to speak. In all that follows, it is important that the reader fully understands that Sir Edward Grey made a statement to Parliament and through Parliament and the press to the nation. It was not a debate. Grey was not subjected to questions from MPs nor asked to explain himself. Time and again, he and his co-conspirators had promised that any British military commitments or naval agreements with France or Russia would require the official approval of the House of Commons. All understood this to mean an informed debate in Parliament followed by a vote. There was no debate. There was no vote. The secret elite and their agents did not seek democratic approval for anything they had previously organized or engineered, and they did not seek parliamentary approval for taking Britain to war. By clever turn of phrase and repetitive lie, Grey deceived the House of Commons into believing that it was free to make the most momentous decision in history. The warmongers hailed Grey's position as statesmanlike and noble, and talked of duty and loyalty, obligations, and integrity. The many voices raised against this same speech were drowned out by secret elite agents in Parliament, dismissed by most of the daily newspaper, and have been more or less ignored altogether by historians. It was not a great speech. Leo O'Meara mocked it as narrow and uninspiring, but nevertheless it was of monumental importance. The House of Commons has rarely hung on the words of a Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs with such studied attention. Sir Edward Grey set the tone by announcing that peace in Europe cannot be preserved, and distanced himself and the Foreign Office from any previous involvement or collusion. His moral stance stemmed from a claim that we have consistently worked with a single mind, with all the earnestness in our power to preserve peace. Given his connivance with Izvolsky and Sazonov, Poincare, the Committee of Imperial Defense, the secret agreements and understandings, and all of the scheming that had encouraged Berchtold and the Austrians to make the demands on Serbia, that was a breathtaking lie. He accepted that Russia and Germany had declared war on each other, almost as if to say, what could be done about that? The implication that Britain and British diplomats had nothing to do with these events was entirely false. Grey's appeal to British interests, British honor, and British obligation was lifted from Sir Erie Crow's memorandum, which is hardly surprising since he would have carefully rehearsed his speech with his Foreign Office accomplices before facing the Commons. He stressed that the House was free to decide what the British attitude should be and promised to publish parliamentary evidence that would prove how genuine and wholehearted his efforts for peace were. When these were made available to Parliament at a later date, the diplomatic notes had been carefully selected and included 3 telegrams that had never actually been sent. Worse still were the carefully amended versions, absolute proof of Foreign Office double dealings. Gray admitted that conversations had been going on for some time between British and French naval and military experts, but MPs did not realize that he had sanctioned these since 1906 without seeking permission of the cabinet. He produced a letter from the French ambassador, Paul Cambon, which conveniently explained that whatever the disposition of the French and British fleets, they were not based on a commitment to cooperate in war. It was a downright lie, but MPs and the British people had to be misled. In response to an interruption from Lord Charles Beresford, Grey was obliged to confess that the letter had been written some 2 years previously, yet had never been revealed to Parliament. Much worse than that, he read out only part of a formal letter between his office and the French authorities, deliberately omitting the crucial final sentence. If these measures involved action, the plan of the General Staffs would at once be taken into consideration and the governments would then decide what effect should be given to them. End quote. The plans of the General Staffs? What plans? How did this come about? There would have been uproar amongst the Liberals, the Labour Party, and Irish Home Rulers had Grey revealed that plans for joint military action had been agreed between the General Staffs of both nations. After the denials that had been made to Prince Lichnowsky and the Kaiser would instantly have been unmasked. All of the denials that had been made to Prince Lichnowsky and the Kaiser would instantly have been unmasked. All of Prime Minister Asquith's previous statements in parliaments denying that secret agreements tied Britain to France in the event of a war with Germany would have been revealed as deliberate deceptions. In his personal memoirs published in 1925, Sir Edward Grey claimed that the charge of omitting the final sentence was not brought to his notice till 1923. He could only imagine that he had been interrupted when reading the letter, or perhaps I thought the last sentence unimportant, as it did not affect the sense or main purport of what had already been read out. End quote. Ridiculous. Truly and utterly ridiculous. That final sentence would have destroyed Gray's speech and exposed years of secret preparation for war. Gray repeatedly stressed that the government and the House of Commons was perfectly free to decide what to do, and that no previous diplomatic arrangement stood in the way of democratic decision-making. No previous diplomatic arrangement stood in the way of democratic decision-making. In fact, he had absolutely no intention of asking the House of Commons for its opinion. The secret elites was the only opinion that mattered. When he reminded the House that Britain had a long-standing friendship with France, a voice from the surrounding seats shouted, "And with Germany," but the remark was pointedly ignored. With amazing hypocrisy and deceptiveness, he painted a fanciful picture of the northern and western coast of France standing absolutely undefended. He asked how the public would react if a foreign fleet, everyone knew it could only be German, bombarded the undefended coast of France within sight of Britain's shores. He admitted that he had assured the French ambassador that in the event of hostile operations against the French coast or shipping, the British fleet would step in to support and protect them, subject as always to the mythical approval of the House of Commons. What a stunning confession. 2 days previously, Gray's Undersecretary Sir Arthur Nicholson had reminded him that It was at Britain's behest that France had moved her fleets to the Mediterranean in 1912 on the absolute understanding that the British Navy would protect their northern and western coasts. Gray was describing a strategy that the Admiralty and Foreign Office had initiated 2 years earlier, but was falsely implying that it had only just been agreed because of the escalating European crisis. The entire construct was false. He admitted that the fleet had been mobilized and the armies was in the process of full mobilization, though he felt it necessary to add that as yet no troops had left the country. The Foreign Secretary took some time warming up his audience before unveiling the focal point of his statement: Belgian neutrality. His trump card was his greatest lie, for Belgium was neutral only in name. The heavy veil of secrecy that had been drawn over Belgium's preparation to side with Britain and France against Germany proved its worth. In a moment of time that caused the purpose of Gray's dramatic delivery, this was his coup d'etat, the stunning presentation of neutral Belgium as the innocent victim of German aggression was biblical in its imagery and grotesque in its deceit. The Treaty of 1839, which allegedly obliged Britain to defend Belgian neutrality, was dredged up as the reason for taking Britain to war. This despite repeated pronunciation by Asquith and others which denied that there were any treaties or alliances which compelled Britain to go to war. An emotional telegram from the King of the Belgians to his good friend King George, pleading for assistance, was read to the crowded Commons. The fact that it had been delivered from Buckingham Palace, hot foot to Grey, was intended as a signal to MPs from the King that the country had an obligation towards Belgium. Grey invoked emotional blackmail. If Belgian neutrality was abused by Germany, he asked, would Britain, endowed as it was with influence and power, stand by and witness the perpetration of the direst crime that ever stained the pages of history, and thus become participators in the sin? The direst crime that ever stained the pages of history. Had no one in the Foreign Office read Edith Durham's account of the slaughter of thousands of innocents in the Balkans? Were the massacres in Albania, Serbia, and Bulgaria of no consequence? Had Gray forgotten the atrocities in the Congo, where the Belgian king's mercenaries slaughtered millions, outraging world opinion in 1908? But then most of these people were black or Muslims or from other such ethnic groups, and therefore of little value in secret elite thinking. Sir Edward Gray's hyperbole and melodramatic statements were truly worthy of ridicule, but his words were greeted with loud cheers from the jingoistic conservatives on the opposition benches. Gray had long known that his entire argument would be predicated on Belgian neutrality. It had been absolutely vital that Belgium remained apart from the Entente and did not seek membership, so that its neutrality could be construed as a sacred issue, a point of principle that necessitated British support when the time came. Consider the whole charade of neutrality that the secret elite used to manipulate British foreign policy. No formula for British neutrality could ever square with the naval and military obligations that had been agreed directly with France, and more indirectly with Russia. There was no neutrality. It was another lie, a shameless posture to deceive Germany and bring about war. He painted a picture of Europe in a state of collapse, stating that if Belgium fell, the independence of Holland would follow, and then Denmark. Neither happened. He was strident in his determination to present the case for war as inevitable. His claims became even more excitable. The impact of going to war was described as such that we shall suffer but little more than we shall suffer even if we stand aside. Grey prophesied an end to foreign trade, a ridiculous assertion given the power of the British Navy and the spread of the British Empire. The Guardian later lambasted his lack of commercial knowledge and his ignorance of the workings of trade, but he was pushing every alarm button, raising every fear, pandering to every prejudice. Pandering to every prejudice. Yet he found one bright spot in all of his well-rehearsed alarm. Ireland, in the midst of all the doom and gloom and talk of imminent civil war, he asserted that the Irish question was no longer an issue, which we feel we have now to take into account. End quote. Why? What had happened to justify such an unexpected claim? From what authority could he suddenly draw the conclusion that the general feeling throughout Ireland was in favor of British foreign policy? Edward Grey's doublespeak lent him the appearance of a man of honor. In reality, he was deliberately guiding the nation to a world war. You could not contemplate Britain's unconditional neutrality. Such action was bound to sacrifice our respect and good name and reputation before the world, and should not escape the most serious and grave economic consequences. His doom-laden statement promised suffering and misery from which no country in Europe will escape and from which no abdication of neutrality will save us. He made great play of the notion that the most awful responsibility is resting upon the government in deciding what to advise the House of Commons to do. The House of Commons was not being offered a choice. It was being advised that there was no choice. He sat down to a storm of cheering and acclaim from the Conservatives, part orchestrated, part genuine. Leo Ameri caustically found it so long and so dull that I more than once fell asleep. As an inner circle member of the secret elite, Gray's speech would have come as no surprise to Ameri, but he admitted that it was better received by the liberals than the government had expected. The majority of liberal MPs were stunned by what they had heard. Suddenly, without debate, consensus, or warning, the liberal government, was on the brink of declaring war. Irish members were bemused to hear that the Irish question was about to suddenly evaporate and no longer pose a problem should Britain go to war. Had the Ulster Unionists promised unconditional support? Had the South? What followed was truly remarkable. The leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party, Bonar Law, solemnly acknowledged that the government had done everything in its power to preserve peace, but if any other course is taken, it is because it is forced upon them, and that they have no alternative. This same man had described Asquith, Churchill, Lloyd George, and Grey as the most incompetent, policyless people to be found on earth, and warned they were drifting to disaster. Barely 3 weeks before, Bonar Law boldly told Edward Grey that if he could not use his influence to preserve peace in his own land, Ireland, he could do no good abroad. These members of the secret elite played the parliamentary game of charades to preserve the facade of democracy. Sir Edward Grey knew well in advance that fellow placemen in the Conservative Party would support war. Churchill had carefully vetted their attitude, and Asquith was sent a personal letter of unqualified Conservative support. Hours before Grey's speech, Asquith had yet again been reassured that the Conservatives would stand with him by Bonar Law and Lord Lansdowne. Conservative support in the House of Commons was a prearranged pantomime, a pantomime that played well to the press gallery. The secret elite had never let party politics interfere with its spheres of influence. They controlled them all. That John Reading, leading member of the Irish Home Rule Party, should have risen to promise the support of Catholic Ireland appeared much more astonishing. That John Redmond, leading member of the Irish Home Rule Party, should have risen to promise the support of Catholic Ireland appeared much more astonishing. His bold suggestion that Ireland could defend itself, thus releasing the British Army for service elsewhere, was astounding but effective. Asquith noted gratefully that Redmond cut in effectively to offer support to the government. Even his very language had a sense of stage management. No one, no one on the Irish Home Rule benches expected Redmond to make any comment. There had been no prior consultation, as was both customary and obligatory on important issues. Redmond was, by understanding and agreement, more of a party chairman than a leader. John Dillon, the most important of the Irish Home Rulers, was in Dublin on that fateful afternoon. Redmond acted in his own right, and officially there had been no consultation between him and the government. It appeared that he had simply been swept away by Grey's rhetoric, but an article in the Times on October 1, stating that government troops could be withdrawn safely from Ireland, exposed that as a lie. There was also evidence that Redmond met with Asquith immediately before Grey's speech. The Times, secret meetings, deals. What was Redmond's association with the secret elite? Of the party leaders, only Ramsay MacDonald stood firm against the swelling tide of orchestrated inevitability. He rejected the idea that the country was in danger. He ridiculed the concept of statements appealing to their nation's honor, and reminded the Commons that Britain had fought the Crimean War because of our honor. We rushed into South Africa because of our honor. MacDonald asked what was the use of talking about going to the aid of Belgium when what was really happening meant engaging in a pan-European war that was going to alter the boundaries of our nations, of many nations. He wanted to know what this would mean for Russian domination when it was all over. Then, quite remarkably, this historic assembly, which had long considered itself a champion of free speech, was denied precisely that by the Prime Minister. Members wanted to discuss Grey's statement at length. Had he not just said that the House was free to decide what the British attitude should be? Asquith responded by promising an early opportunity for discussion. Today, shouted a number of members of Parliament. The reply was unequivocally negative. There would be no debate that day. The Commons had listened in good order to a singularly biased statement, laced with emotional blackmail, but was refused permission to discuss these affairs at that very point where delay made any response worthless. A very fragmented cabinet had been ground into acquiescence. The decision to go to war had already been taken by the secret elite, by their cabinet agents, through the mobilization of fleet and army, by the Northcliffe press, and all with the full knowledge of the monarch. They were not interested in alternative views. Asquith and his pro-war colleagues cynically abused democracy, but democracy has the capacity to express itself in unexpected ways. The Prime Minister had tried to close the matter to debate, but the Speaker of the House of Commons was not privy to the secret machinations and made an unexpected offer. He suggested a procedural maneuver that would allow the House to adjourn at 4:35 p.m. and reassemble at 7 p.m. that same night. Asquith was not to have his way. The Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs left the House of Commons immediately. His work was far from finished. He had, by his own admission, decisions to make, but there was one thing he knew for certain. It did not matter whether that decision was to declare war on Germany or to impose impossible conditions on her. He knew that conditions meant war just as surely as the declaration of war. Respect for the neutrality of Belgium must be one of the conditions, and this Germany would not respect. Yet another lie, demolished entirely by the evidence of chapter 26, but a lie that Gray had to repeat many times to make it feel like the truth. Churchill caught up with him outside the Commons and asked what he intended to do next. He was eager to get started. Gray's reply was stunning in its simplicity, but a master stroke. Now we will send them an ultimatum to stop the invasion of Belgium within 24 hours. It was the condition to which he knew Germany could not accede. Having set the nation to focus on Belgium, to make it the point of honor, Gray immediately proceeded to lure Germany into a position where it would appear that Britain had no alternative other than to go to war. That was a certainty, for he knew the German army was already on its way through Belgium. Meanwhile, that same afternoon, Haldane summoned a war council. Lord Kitchener, now consul general in Egypt, who happened to be in London, was present. What was more astonishing was that Haldane invited Lord Roberts to attend his select council, a remarkable invitation given that Roberts had retired from his post of commander-in-chief of the British Army 10 years earlier. But Roberts had never retired. Roberts, who had shared so many platforms with his friend Alfred Milner and was at the heart of the secret elite, was still the decision maker. His influence dominated military thinking through the promoted members of his academy. It was they who liaised with the French and Belgian general staffs and prepared the detailed plans for the British Expeditionary Force. It was they who would lead the British Army to war. This was their purpose. When the House of Commons reconvened at 7:20 p.m. on August 3, 1914, the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary were cheered, mainly by the opposition. Sir Edward Grey opened by announcing that he had received information from the Belgian legation in London, Sir Edward Grey opened by announcing that he had received information from the Belgian legation in London, not available to him when he made his speech earlier in the afternoon. It was the details of the German note to Belgium sent the previous evening at 7 p.m., which offered friendly neutrality if the German troops were allowed safe passage. Yet again, Grey was lying to Parliament. A telegram from the French ambassador in London to French Prime Minister Vivani proved that Grey had been told about the German offer by Paul Cambon on the morning of August 3rd, hours before his initial statement. Grey had withheld this information from the cabinet and thereafter from Parliament so that his centerpiece on Belgian neutrality could be portrayed as an absolute condition for declaring war on Germany. Had it become known that the Germans had offered the Belgians terms for neutrality, his whole argument would have been destroyed. A number of prominent liberals rose to challenge Grey's claims and expressed their horror at the prospect of war being visited on Britain. Philip Morel stressed that Germany had never refused to negotiate and had guaranteed Belgian integrity. He added, "We are going to war now because of fear and jealousy fostered by large sections of the press. The fear and jealousy of German ambition, that is the real reason." He summed up the calamitous situation by ending, "I regret very much at the end of 8 years of the policy which has been pursued of the Triple Entente, that it should have landed us into such a war as this." This theme was continued by Edmund Harvey, who claimed that war had been caused by men in high places, by diplomatists working in secret, by bureaucrats who are out of touch with the people of the world. Keir Hardie implored the government to consider the plight of the poor, the unemployed, and starving children. Both houses of Parliament had unanimously passed a bill for the relief of the stock exchange, but Hardie was more interested in a bill to compel local authorities to feed local school children. He was barracked from the conservative benches when he added, "Most of the members of this House have more of a direct interest in the stock exchange than they have in the sufferings of the poor. Little changes." Though this short adjournment debate ended at 8:15 p.m., a further debate on Gray's speech began again at the insistence of angry liberal members. It was a futile exercise. Most of those whose minds the anti-war members of Parliament sought to change chose not to stay. They were off preparing for war. Lloyd George, though, was present at the start to answer a question on food supplies. Percy Molteno, the Liberal MP of Dumfriesshire, and an outspoken critic of the Boer War, was first on his feet to detail the many assurances given to Parliament over the previous years that there were no unpublished agreements which would hamper or restrict the freedom of the government or Parliament to decide whether or not Great Britain should participate in a war. He felt desperately let down by the government he had long supported and asked bitterly of Asquith and Grey, who had informed the people that they were a government of peace and they would seek to maintain peace, whether they were not compelled to honor their obligations to their supporters. In a passage that would echo down the ages and still resonate a century later, Mr. Molteno declared, "They have brought us to the brink of disaster without our knowing, and without our being warned. I say that at the last moment, they should give the people of this country a chance to decide." This is a continuation of that old and disastrous system where a few men in charge of the state, wielding the whole force of the state, make secret engagements and secret arrangements carefully veiled from the knowledge of the people, who are as dumb driven cattle without a voice on the question. And anybody can tell the country what are the important considerations that ought to weigh with us in taking part in this tremendous struggle. What an apt metaphor. The dumb driven cattle were being herded towards the global abattoir for reasons they would never properly know. A few men wielding the whole force of the state with secret arrangements and secret agreements had unleashed the demon war and sanctioned the slaughter. Molteno pointed an accusatory finger at the politicians who had fronted the decision, but it was the secret elite who hid their all-powerful influence behind the carefully veiled parliamentary screen. Another liberal, W. Llewellyn Williams, accused Grey of disguising his motives and falsely arousing war fever. If you had asked any man in this country, whatever his politics might be, whether he could calmly contemplate the entrance of his country into this quarrel, he would have said no. Even today, this country does not want war. Now is the only time to speak before the war fever has come to its height. I beg and implore this government to use every effort in their power to avert this terrible calamity, not only to our own prosperity, but to the civilization of the world. Others questioned the impact in constituencies where factories were closing down and people could hardly afford to buy bread for their family. Russian opportunism was repeatedly criticized. In his absence, Grey was berated for the sinister injustice of seeing Germany as the enemy, while ignoring the fact that Russia had mobilized her forces first. It was a basic truth. Russia had mobilized first. Russia had caused the war. The objectors could see that Britain was being railroaded into war, and asked what benefit it would be if Germany were crushed by an all-conquering Russia. One liberal member wanted to know why Belgian neutrality was suddenly of such vital consequence to Britain's national honor, when no one suggested making war to protect the integrity of Finland, which was being suppressed by a semi-civilized, barbaric, and brutal Russia. The warmongers sought to close the quasi-debate by shouting down speakers, but such loutish behavior only served to spur on the North Somerset Liberal MP Joseph King. He didn't hold back. Why had only one member of Parliament voiced support for the Foreign Secretary, even although he apparently had the wholehearted approval of both government and official opposition? Was the cabinet united? Who would resign? He continued to tear apart the pretense of parliamentary unity by asking why the Conservative members from Ireland had not given immediate assurances of their support. By the time Mr. King reminded them that a short time ago honorable members from Ulster were declaring they would invite the Kaiser over, he was being drowned out. His views on Russia and the expediency of their mobilization are worthy of note. King stated that because of all the internal uprisings, localized and national strikes, and threats of civil war, Russia had mobilized their army and thrown the whole of Europe into war for its own sake. They had no great political or patriotic motive other than to preserve the privilege of the ruling classes. He concluded, if we are fighting for Russia at the present time, we are fighting for an amount of tyranny and injustice and cruelty which it is quite impossible to think of without the deepest indignation. His views were perfectly valid and completely justified, but what he could not grasp, what none of them could grasp, was the much more sinister fact that Russia, like France, was being used to a greater secret elite purpose. Joseph King's final point was equally stunning. When Franz Ferdinand's assassination was first announced, the Prime Minister had proposed a resolution which was accepted in solemn silence. Asquith had extended his tender respect to the great family of nations headed by the Austrian Emperor and offered them affectionate sympathy. 5 weeks later, that same government was proposing to wage war against them. King called it tragic, bitter, and cynical. He asked if British foreign policy had become so shifting and changing that the people to whom every sympathy was offered one day were our declared foes the next. He was not given an answer. What he could not understand because of all the confusions around him was that the foreign policy had not changed one iota since the moment that the secret elite decided that Germany had to be crushed. The lies, the deviousness, the secrecy, the posturing, and the pretense had ambushed the voices of reason raised against war. As each and every contributor attacked government policy, challenged every step, asked more and more telling questions, it became even more evident that there was a very strong body of articulate opinion ranged against Sir Edward Grey. At which point Arthur Balfour, former Conservative Prime Minister and a member of the secret elite's inner circle, rose menacingly. He had heard enough. Balfour derided their objections as the very dregs and lees of the debate, in no way representing the various views of the members of the House. With consummate arrogance, he patronized all that had been said before his interruption, stating that what they were engaged in was a relatively impotent and evil debate. How could this be a serious occasion, he asked, when none of the senior government ministers were present? What spurious nonsense. Senior government ministers had actively chosen not to be present. If these discussions were denied the trappings of a serious occasion, it was entirely because those ministers refused to be there. Balfour betrayed his real purpose when he ventured to think that the points which had been raised might be misunderstood in the country and would certainly be misunderstood abroad. Was Balfour sent in to bring it to a halt? He said as much when he alluded to the damage these opinions might do abroad. War had not been formally declared, but Parliament was being silenced, and it took a former Conservative Prime Minister to bring the discussions to a close. Arthur James Balfour, member of the Society of the Elect of the Secret Elite, personal and long-term friend of Milner, Lansdowne, Curzon, Asquith, Gray, and Haldane did the job for them. The Guardian described the evening debate as serious and patriotic, and its prevailing tone reflected that of sober opinion in the country. Ameri called the voices raised against war the radical crank selection, the radical crank section, and the Times dismissed the whole protest in a single sentence. When Gray forwarded that infamous ultimatum to Berlin, it required a positive reassurance that Belgium's neutrality would not be violated by Germany. The deadline was set for midnight on August 4th of 1914. At some stage during the day, an unknown person realized that Greenwich Mean Time was set 1 hour behind Germany, and the decision was not taken to advance the deadline to match the time in Berlin. There has never been an official explanation why such a decision was made, or by whom, or at what stage in the day. This decision had to be sanctioned by Sir Edward Grey, so the question to be asked is, why? Is this the action of a man who had reputedly tried every possible diplomatic channel to protect the peace of Europe? No, the two actions do not sit together. Was Sir Edward Grey afraid of some last-minute change of heart by the German military or a timely intervention by the Kaiser? Perhaps, as A.J.P. Taylor famously wrote, they just wanted to get it settled and go to bed. Yes, that is precisely what happened. They wanted to get this war against Germany started, and no insignificant time difference would be allotted to halt it. The German High Command was taken aback by Gray's ultimatum. Chancellor Bethmann fulminated a British duplicity in a speech delivered at the Reichstag on the 4th of August. He lambasted Sir Edward Grey for secretly encouraging France and hence Russia. He argued that war would have been impossible if the British cabinet had made it absolutely clear to all the parties that they were not prepared to allow a continental war to develop from the Austrian-Serbian conflict. Britain, he claimed, sought to take advantage of the international crisis by seizing the opportunity to destroy her greatest European competitors in the markets of the world. He dismissed Belgian neutrality as a lame excuse, a mask to cover the main intent, which was to destroy German economic power, assisted by two great continental armies from Russia and France. Bethmann accused Britain of seeing herself as the arbitrarium mundi, the self-appointed ombudsman on the international stage. He was correct on every point, but official histories would mock his justified rage. Thus, the casus belli, the German invasion of Belgium, had been steamrollered through Parliament, the opposition flattened and the screamers ignored. Once Asquith knew that war with Germany would be declared, he urgently contacted Edward Carson to cancel Plan B. It was no longer needed. Professor Quigley revealed that the Ulster Unionist leader had a prepared coded telegram ready to be dispatched to the UVF to seize control on Belfast at his given signal. This ultra-secret strategy was revealed to the Inner Core Roundtable member Lionel Curtis by Carson himself once the war was underway. If an unbiased observer was invited to take a hard look at how the British Empire and all of its manifestations went to war, they would be amazed that such a process of undemocratic decision-making permitted a tiny clique of elected officials, bolstered by a larger, less visible, but overwhelmingly influential cabal, to achieve their ultimate goal, war with Germany. The cabinet played no part whatsoever in this process once it had sanctioned the primacy of Belgian neutrality. No one, with the possible but unrecorded exception of the Prime Minister, was given sight of the ultimatum sent by Sir Edward Grey. Before he even sent it, Gray was fully aware that the condition he demanded had already been violated. German troops were headed into Belgium. The cabinet did not authorize the declaration of war. It was never asked to. Parliament itself was informed of events belatedly, but was given neither proper time to debate nor any opportunity to vote on war or neutrality. Opposition to the war was stifled as quickly as possible. The first time that any vote could have taken place was on August 6, when the government sought approval for the finances they imagined would sustain a war that they had entered to 2 days earlier. Nor were governments and parliaments across the empire consulted. Millions of subjects of the king found themselves at war against an enemy about whom they had no knowledge. So who declared war? Technically, it was King George V, who, as a matter of royal prerogative, had to sanction the proclamation of a state of war from 11 p.m. on that fateful night. A Privy Council meeting was held late on in Buckingham Palace. It began at 10:30 p.m. in the presence of His Majesty, one Lord of the Realm, and two court officials. It ended with the royal assent. It was a dark deed done by a lesser monarch in the presence of men whose names are long forgotten. The act was purely symbolic, but ultimately catastrophic. It was as if some medieval rite cursed the 20th century. The will of the secret elite was sanctioned by a pliant monarch whose pen unleashed the hounds of hell. Summary. Chapter 27. The speech that cost 1,000,000 dead. Sir Edward Grey's statement on August 3, 1914 was not a debate, so he was not challenged on the issues he put before the House of Commons when he sat down. He began by stressing the utter lie, and that he and his Foreign Office colleagues had done everything possible to preserve peace in Europe. While he reiterated yet again that Parliament was free to decide what British attitude should be, he never at any point sought its opinions. He deliberately gave the false impression that the conversations with France that had been ongoing since 1905 made no commitment to go to war by omitting to tell Parliament that these included plans agreed by both general staffs. He introduced the imaginary scenario whereby the German fleet might bombard the undefended French Channel coast without explaining that the disposition of the French and British fleets had been arranged at Britain's behest in 1912, and on the understanding that the British fleet would protect the French coast. The whole issue of neutrality, of the violation of Belgian neutrality and its consequences was the central argument in Sir Edward Grey's cause for war. Appeals for help from the Belgian king to King George were introduced as a means of indicating support for action from the monarchy. Grey's language became increasingly excited. Talk of the direst crime that ever stained the pages of history, and the claim that Britain would suffer equally badly whether she was involved directly or not, was pure nonsense. At the end of Grey's speech, Bonar Law, the conservative leader, rose in pre-planned approval to voice total and unconditional support for the government's actions. John Redmond spoke for the Irish Home Rulers and, most surprisingly, promised their support too. What deals had been done? The only party leader to speak out immediately against the tone and the content of Grey's speech was Labour leader Ramsay MacDonald. Members of the House of Commons asked for an immediate debate but were rebuffed by Prime Minister Asquith. However, to the chagrin of the secret elite, the Speaker of the House of Commons agreed to find time to discuss the issues later that night. Grey immediately left Parliament to send the fateful ultimatum to Germany, knowing full well that the invasion of Belgium, which was the central British condition, was already underway. It was a declaration of war. When the House of Commons reconvened There was an outpouring of bitter objection to Sir Grey's statement, especially from Liberal MPs who felt personally betrayed by what they had heard. Grey's statement was ripped apart. Pointed and unanswered questions were raised about Russia, the lies previously told in Parliament, and the fearful consequences of war. The clamor against any proposed war was stopped in its track by one of the most senior secret elitist agents in Parliament, A.J. Balfour. He rose to demand an end to the proceedings because the debate was unrepresentative and would give a poor impression to the public. That could have only happened if the debate had been reported in the newspapers. Once the casus belli of Belgium was achieved, Plan B was redundant. War was formally proclaimed by King George V at Buckingham Palace on August 4, 1914.